Hello and welcome to Projector at the London Film Festival. Coming up on this episode, we've got two very different movies about musicians. Riz Ahmed writes, produces and stars in Mogul Mowgli, while a disciple tries to practice greatness at Northern Indian classical music. As you know, many film festivals have gone online this year due to COVID-19, and London Film Festival is no exception, although LFF does actually have a physical schedule this year. In addition to the virtual schedule, many of the films in competition will screen at the usual locations at the BFI South Bank, although notably the Disney Pixar movie Soul is only screening at the BFI South Bank. There are no virtual screenings for that movie, not even for critics, so unfortunately that won't be a part of my coverage. I was very lucky, nay honoured, to get press credentials this year, and that means that I can finally cover the London Film Festival for the first time. Previously that wasn't very practical because obviously the festival goes on for a fortnight, and that's a heck of a lot of travel expenses. I have previously covered the opening and closing night films, notably The Imitation Game and Breathe in previous years, but that was as far as it went. This year, I've got virtual press screenings for all the films, but obviously I can't watch every single one of them, nor can I really review all of them either. That's just simply not practical. So I'm going to be cherry picking the highlights of the festival, and also some other movies with some interesting log lines. It's going to be an adventure, and I hope you'll join me on it. Some of these films you might have heard of, you might know that they're coming out in the coming months, and then there'll be some others that you'll have never heard of for the first time, and hopefully you'll enjoy me talking about them regardless of what situation they're in. Right, let's get started with Mogul Mowgli. British Pakistani rapper Zed, played by Riz Ahmed, is on the cusp of hitting the big time, being offered the opportunity to be the opening act on a European tour. While returning home to visit his family, including his father Bashir, played by Ali Khan, Zed is hospitalised with an autoimmune disorder that causes his muscles to weaken. With his career and health in jeopardy, Zed attempts to recover from his illness as he reflects on the legacy of his music and his Pakistani heritage. Mogul Mowgli is the first narrative feature directed by Basim Tarak, who previously was only known for documentaries. He met up with Riz Ahmed and they bonded over their shared Pakistani background, and through that came this project which they co-wrote together. You can tell this is a real passion project for Riz Ahmed. Not only does he co-write and star in it, he also produces it as well, and you can tell that he has a real deep connection to the material, to the point where they've incorporated actual home movie footage of him in the film's opening. That might explain why he's played two very similar roles in quite quick succession. At last year's festival season, he appeared in another movie called The Sound of Metal, where he played a drummer who was going deaf, who had to learn to adapt to his new condition, and that was highly acclaimed at the time. So if you're getting a little bit of deja vu here, you're not the only one, and I'm certainly not the only person to actually confuse the two movies, because The Sound of Metal was bought by Amazon and is being released very shortly in theatres and later on Prime, while Mogul Mowgli is playing at this year's festival season and will also come out shortly. So if you're kind of confusing the two films, on a surface level they do sound similar, but thematically they're two very different movies. Mogul Mowgli is very much a movie about identity, and the film puts that right at the forefront. The film opens with a sequence where Zed comes out on stage and raps about his Pakistani heritage. Later on, there's another sequence where he raps about the question of where are you from, and as he puts it, the question seems simple, but the answer's kind of long. He's a British Pakistani man trying to be successful in America, so obviously there's a lot of various conflicting feelings as different cultures try to make their imprint on him, and also he's trying to make himself commercially successful in the Western world, so there are certain elements of his Pakistani culture that he's trying to downplay in his stage persona. This is particularly clear in his name Zed, which is actually a nickname because his birth name is Zahid, and when he comes back to visit his family, certainly that, among other things, is a bone of contention there. Certainly that causes a lot of friction within his family and even with other fans as well. There's a moment where Zed confronts one of his fans who gets very, very angry because he's not following the proper procedure in Pakistani culture of handing things over with his right hand. He does it with his left hand instead, which is quite offensive. But now that he's back home, Zed has to confront his family and his heritage in a way that he's avoided with life on the road. There's a moment where he finds one of his very earliest rap tapes, and he realises that he's recorded over a tape of partition prayers. And that right there tells you that Zed is someone that has struggled to connect truly with his culture, but also rejects it to a certain extent. And that causes a lot of familial strife, especially with his father Bashir, played by Ali Khan, who was never entirely supportive of his musical career. Likewise, I think there's a part of Zed that's also somewhat embarrassed by his father and the way that he's opened multiple businesses to try and support his family, notably the fact that Bashir opened a chicken shop that was African themed, so he was appropriating another culture, and that causes Zed a lot of embarrassment in hindsight. But this idea of Zed as someone who rejects his culture and it's eating away at him, it becomes a literal metaphor with his autoimmune disorder, because he is literally rejecting parts of himself. And so over the course of the film, he has to learn to embrace that. He has to confront those feelings if he's going to find a way through his illness. But what makes Mogul Mowgli well worth seeing is that it's another fantastic performance from Riz Ahmed, playing a character that's not a million miles away from himself. It's clearly been designed with autobiographical elements. So, like Zed, Riz Ahmed is a rapper in real life, so he gets to incorporate those skills into his performance. Zed is not necessarily the most likeable character. He's very, very career driven, and that's to the point where his girlfriend actually breaks up with him at the beginning of the movie. Bina knows that their relationship isn't at the forefront of his mind and that he's going to be a very absentee boyfriend. But that also means that when Zed falls ill, he actually has a lot of drive and ambition. He wants to get back on the stage. He wants to go back and be the opening act. He keeps saying that he's going to be, even though even he probably knows that that's not really going to be the case because he needs time to recover. But it gives him something to aspire towards. And it also helps that Ahmed is such a charismatic performer. You really get to see that in those rap sequences. There aren't many of them because that's obviously not the kind of movie that this is, but nevertheless, those are the real high points, in my opinion. Seeing Ahmed on stage in his element, spitting out rhymes like bullets, seemingly at the speed of light, and it's so intelligent and it's so quick. And then you contrast that with the later scenes where he's in the hospital, where he's so weak and enfeebled that he can barely lift himself off the toilet. And it's a real stark contrast, and it's a really great performance that shows both how great he is on stage, but also the sort of personal conflict as well, and how those things actually shape his persona at the same time. There's also a fairly amusing little subplot about another rapper who aspires to be Zed called RPG, who is a great little bit of comic relief because he's another Pakistani rapper, but he's not really up to the same level, and Zed certainly looks down upon him because he does a lot more kind of traditional brag rap. And he's sort of meant to be this little caricature in the centre of the movie. And I think that that character is needed and necessary. I think that it provides a little bit of levity to what could have been a kind of overwhelming film given the subject matter. But if the rap sequences show someone whose mind is lively and active, then the film tries to incorporate that stylistically in its approach, especially in the second half. Once Zed is hospitalised, he spends much of the rest of the movie either in bed or in wheelchairs, or moving as little as his weakened muscles will allow. And because of that gives him plenty of time to ruminate. He's trapped with his thoughts, and his mind is restless. And because of that, he is literally wrestling with his culture. There's a moment where he's actually wrestling and fighting someone, and he sees visions all throughout this movie, especially of his Pakistani heritage. There's a figure that keeps popping up over and over again, at one point even standing on his back as he struggles to get off of the floor, almost as if the weight of it is too much to bear. He also keeps seeing visions of his father on one of the refugee trains during the partition of India and Pakistan, and having that also be something that keeps going over in his mind. You keep hearing the sound of the trains on the soundtrack over and over again, but it mostly seems like he's wrestling with his insecurities and how he's getting older and he has to face up to what legacy that he wants to leave, both in terms of his career, where he's frightened as someone that is older and may not get many more chances after this, but also as someone from Pakistani heritage and having all these different conflicting feelings and also the obligations that he has to live up to. There's a moment where they talk about the experimental treatment they're going to put Zed on, and they mention how it could leave him sterile, and that's something that his father refuses to accept, to the point where, because he's very, very questioning of traditional medicine, he tries to use cupping as a way of trying to heal his son. It's clear he wants the best for his son, but Zed feels pressured because of it, and that father-son dynamic is the heart of the film, I feel, especially once Zed starts embracing where he came from, in both senses of that phrase. The movie throws a lot of metaphor and imagery at the audience, to the point where it can be a little bit dense and intimidating, but that does have the effect of placing you in Zed's head, who is similarly overwhelmed and confused. I just think that occasionally the movie stacks too many metaphors on top of each other, to the point where what it's trying to say gets a little bit indistinct, but nevertheless, that only goes to show the ambition of the work, and sometimes there are some really striking, bold visuals, especially about seeing the world from that particular viewpoint and having to deal with all these different conflicting desires, urges, and histories at the same time. And I think that on a visual level, there are some really, really evocative and experimental imagery in some of the more abstract moments of the film. Mogul Mowgli isn't entirely successful, but I admire it for what it tries to do, in that it tries to tell this story from a very different perspective than we normally see on screen. Admittedly, it is a fairly niche film, but a very personal one as well, and for that reason I think they'll be deeply resonant for the British Pakistani community, who will get to see their struggles on screen as well as their culture and history. It's clearly a movie that has a lot to say, almost to its own detriment, but Riz Ahmed's brilliant performance here holds the movie together even when it threatens to pull itself apart. That being said though, I think the messiness is more a feature than a bug, because in its best moments, it feels like a movie being spouted at the speed of consciousness. Mogul Mowgli will be released in UK cinemas later in October. Next up, a man discovers the limits of his talent in The Disciple. All his life, Sharad Narulkar, played by Aditya Modak, has practiced Northern Indian classical music, which he first learnt under his father. Now Sharad practices under his guru, played by Arun Dravid, who trained under the legendary singer Mai, voiced by Sumitra Bhav, who refused to have her singing recorded, but whose lectures Sharad devotedly listens to. Sharad hopes to be known as a great singer, but as the years pass, that dream becomes ever more distant. The Disciple is the second film from Indian director Chaitanya Tamhane, who previously directed the 2014 festival favourite Court, which was about prejudice in the Indian judicial system. This is as good a time as any, I think, to talk about my selection process with what I'm reviewing at the festival, because often I'm only working off a brief synopsis before I see the films, which I'm otherwise going into completely blind. And reading the description for The Disciple, I really wasn't sure if it was going to be for me, because let's face it, I don't have much of a natural inclination towards Northern Indian classical music. what ultimately swayed me into watching the film was some of the notable credits surrounding it, in particular the fact that it's executive produced by Alfonso Cuaron of Gravity and Children of Men fame, and apparently Cuaron has been a mentor figure to Tamhane ever since his first film, and has been hugely supportive of the final product. The Disciple also notably won the Best Screenplay award at the Venice Film Festival, and has got lots of rave reviews. Unfortunately, though, I think my first instinct was correct in this case. The Disciple is a movie about our dreams and ambitions, but also about the limitations of our talent in achieving those things. We first meet our main character Sharad at a concert for his guru, where he's providing backing music, and over the course of one very long camera shot, it very slowly zooms in on Sharad as he's sat behind his guru, clearly intently watching him and with designs on the spotlight for himself one day. But as the shot progresses and the frame gets ever tighter and it pushes past the guru, it squarely locks focus on Sharad, identifying us with the person behind the actual talent that night, and that sets the tone for the movie. Sharad is someone that is clearly very well studied in Northern Indian classical music. He was raised with it ever since he was a boy. He was first taught how to sing by his father, and when he's not practicing, he's digitizing old master tapes to sell in compilations at concerts, and he has a lot of opinions on the subject, and some fairly brutal ones about other singers. He also clearly holds himself in high regard, and clearly wants to put a lot of effort in and get the approval of his guru. But unfortunately, when he does perform, he's not particularly impressive. There's nothing about him that particularly wows us or the guru, who just simply offers a couple of words of advice but is largely somewhat dismissive. He clearly wants to be a breakout star. He clearly wants to be someone to take this traditional music back into the mainstream, but he just doesn't realise that he's not really that person, even if he puts as much in as he does. But despite this, he is so devoted to his ambition, not least of which because he's encouraged by the recordings of an extremely reclusive artist called Mai, who legendarily was one of the best singers of all time, so much so that she never allowed herself to be recorded, and the only way that he does actually have her knowledge is through some surreptitious recordings of her lectures. But she aspires to some kind of musical purity, that you have to be so completely devoted to your ambition. You have to adapt yourself to the idea of loneliness if you are going to pursue this kind of dream. And it's something that Sharad embraces wholeheartedly. He lives a very, very solitary existence. He pushes away his family, who are increasingly frustrated with him in that he's not seeking out some form of relationship or a more stable kind of job. But despite this and numerous other setbacks, he is completely undeterred, often riding out late at night on his motorbike, listening to Mai's lectures, almost as if it's him against the entire rest of the world, and going back to his guru again and again and again, because he knows that his guru was trained by Mai, and he seeks his validation, and in turn, Mai's as well. And that relationship that Sharad has with his guru definitely evolves over the course of the film. It's initially a teacher-pupil one, but as the guru ages, it becomes more of a caregiver and more of a hanger-on, and it shows how desperate things become for Sharad. The story spans a very long stretch of time, and around the midway point, it jumps forward several years, and Sharad is no longer a young, hungry, ambitious talent. He's a middle-aged man that's gained quite a bit of weight, he's got a moustache, and he's become a music teacher. And that shows how incredibly committed Aditya Modak's performance is, playing the character at two very different ages. It's a fairly stark transformation that's almost unrecognisable at first, and it just goes to show how measured his performance is. And there's a real poignancy in seeing the character do the exact same things that we've already seen him do before, but his dream is more elusive than ever. If anything, he's not made any more progress in it, and that is a little bit heartbreaking to a certain extent. But despite this, I didn't really connect with the movie on an emotional level, and often I found myself struggling with it. And that's not just because of the subject matter, although admittedly that wasn't helping. That's largely because of the filmmaking. This is a very, very slow, contemplative movie, to its detriment, really. This is a beautifully photographed film. There are some really gorgeous shots here, but it does feel like I'm held at a distance from what's actually happening on screen, especially by the editing. The editing of the film is done by Tamhane himself, under the encouragement of Cuaron, and as such, the structure of the movie is made up of scenes either in one continuous take or made up of several extended shots. This is particularly true of the singing sequences, which often hold on the performers for several minutes at a time, and clearly as audience members, we're being guided to listen with our ears than look with our eyes. It also, with the extended camera work, puts the mundane mediocrity of Sherrod's life clearly in the spotlight, but it also greatly contributes to a film that I feel is overly static on a visual level to the point where it is fairly dry, and that was a large reason why I found it so uninvolving. It actually was a bit of a slog to get myself invested in the story, but honestly, the biggest detriment to the film and my emotional connection to it was honestly Sherrod himself. As a character, he's so pompous and self-righteous, especially in his opinions about other singers, and it comes off as totally unwarranted when he doesn't have the talent to back it up. And the way that he pushes people out of his life so he can seek this very isolated, selfish ambition, I genuinely struggled to have any real pity for him, especially in the second half of the film, where Sherrod and his lack of success is contrasted with running scenes seen on television of another classical singer who becomes a great success on a talent show, and her fame is contrasted with Sherrod's anonymity, and clearly he's watching her rise to stardom with very envious eyes, hoping that was going to be him. There's also another sequence where Sherrod, as a music teacher, has one of his pupils approach him asking to incorporate different styles into the classical music that he's already been teaching him, and Sherrod responds to this request in an incredibly spiteful way because he feels the pupil has violated the sanctity and purity of the music that he's been teaching him. And in those moments, I genuinely found myself losing any residual sympathy for the character whatsoever. The movie did pick up for me towards the end of it, especially as the character comes to his realisation, and there's a crucial flashback where Sherrod has a confrontation with a classical music expert, and that sequence, I feel, is the best one in the film because it builds up very, very slowly over the course of that. And I also think that the ending of the movie does land properly. I do think that there is something a little bit moving about the situation that Sherrod finds himself in, because honestly, it's one that a lot of creatives can identify with, and especially for someone like me, it does ring a little bit close to home. And I do think the ending is very bittersweet in that way. It does give Sherrod something resembling a positive outcome, if maybe not the one that he really wanted. The Disciple is a bit of a frustrating film for me. I can appreciate it, I understand what it's going for, and I know that it's received a lot of critical praise, but I just think that the movie is largely uninvolving. I think that the subject matter doesn't really help, but that's not really the main issue. My problem is that I just didn't connect with the filmmaking here at all, and really, this is not an example of a bad movie. I didn't dislike this because it's not very well made. It's actually a quite solid movie on that front. The problem is that it just simply wasn't for me, and at the end of the day, That's always going to be an issue when you're watching a film like this. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel so you can see more of my reviews from the London Film Festival that I'll be posting in the coming weeks. If you want to support my show, you can do so over at Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.